Paradox 1. If you're an Iraqi teenager, how do you create a national youth orchestra? Do you go to the Ministry of Culture? Well, directly after a war, they had other things on their mind than listening to teenagers. Do you go to perhaps the Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra in Baghdad? Well, maybe, but the teaching talent that once worked there had long since fled Iraq. So in 2008, a 17-year-old pianist in Baghdad, Zuhal Sultan, wanted a national youth orchestra of Iraq, bringing together Kurds, Arabs, Sunni, Shiite from across her deeply divided land. And the first thing she did was look for a conductor. So the British Council put her in touch with Raw TV, which is a reality TV company in London. And they did a press release throughout the whole of Great Britain. And it was in the Glasgow Herald that I read the headline, "Iraqi Teen Seeks Conductor for Orchestra." And I was immediately struck. After years of violent reporting, I knew nothing about Iraq. Who were their people? What was their culture? What did their music sound like? And where did they get instruments? And so we began an odyssey, which is now in its 5th year, with the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq going to Aix-en-Provence this August to work alongside the National Youth Orchestras of Spain, France, and Italy. But back in 2009, we had huge problems. I needed to audition the players by YouTube. But the internet was so bad that it would take 5 minutes of video up to 10 hours to upload. And that's if there wasn't a power cut to put you back to square one. But the young players of Iraq were so desperate, and they had such faith in Zuhal, that they managed to create these videos and send them to me, a complete stranger. And what I saw broke my heart. They were very serious, but the instruments were terrible. And there were huge problems with the playing, but worse than that, they were joyless. It's as if their instruments were disconnected from their souls. Nevertheless, I went ahead and chose 33 of the best players from 14 to 29 years old from across Iraq's divided society. We also needed an extra $50,000. Now, the London Times had written an article about Zuhal, and that had gone online. And Zuhal sent the link via Twitter to the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, Dr. Baram Saleh. 2 days later, she was in his office, and he gave her the $50,000, which gave us the green light to go ahead. So there, at least, money follows vision. But do you see what's happening here? The internet became our safe space where I, Zuhal, the players, British Council, Raw Television, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq could sidestep the deeply entrenched conflicts of the people of Iraq. And so the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq was born online. Which leads me to my second paradox. If there are no teachers, how can you play? Well, the war had destroyed musical life in Iraq. But ironically, Bach, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, they survived because players could teach themselves from CDs, DVDs, masterclasses on YouTube, and downloading information from the internet. One of our players, Walid, saw Bach's Orchestral Suite No. 2 on television and fell in love with the flautist, who's the soloist in that piece. But he didn't know what the instrument was called. He needed a friend to tell him, "That's a flute you've just fallen in love with." And now he's our first flautist. Zuhal, meanwhile, was using Skype to learn a Mozart piano concerto from a teacher in New York. Now, instruments were terrible, but at least you could buy them or borrow them. Now, that same level of support does not exist for traditional Iraqi music. Also, the war meant that it was too dangerous for young musicians to travel to other musicians. So young players stayed at home, and they used music to create a protective barrier against the world. Now, what we do is we bring everybody together in an intensive orchestral boot camp. During the preparation phase, our safe space was the internet. But now when we meet, that safe space is created by teachers from Germany, Britain, the United States, and the players, where all we care about is making music together. My job as conductor is to sit them down next to each other and get them to lower that protective barrier they've spent years building up so that they can begin to open up to each other as musicians. They don't have to like each other, but they do have to listen and respect. But seriously, how much progress can you really make in 2 or 3 weeks a year? Well, these young players are insanely motivated to learn in a way that we here in the West do not understand. My bass tutor, Dobbs Hartshorn, said to me, "I used to think that good music education was about nice schools and weekly lessons. I now know it's about highly motivated students." And so the most effective, efficient way to deliver music education to a large group of young people is through the orchestra. The internet can support music teaching, but it cannot replace it. Which leads me to my third and most tragic paradox. If you're going through hell, how can you make beautiful music? One of the dreadful effects of war is that it conditions you to be afraid, to be in survival mode long after it's over. And the ongoing terrorist attacks ensure that Iraqis stay in this state of post-traumatic stress. And for young musicians, particularly in Baghdad, stepping over dead bodies to get to school, or disguising their music instrument case for fear it would be seen as a bomb, or worse, a musical instrument, was their childhood reality. So what we do is try to give them back a part of the childhood that they lost during the war. And it's vital that the orchestra gets out of Iraq and performs abroad so that they can relearn normality and take that back home with them to rebuild their culture. But with all this tension and history in the orchestra, how can you play with love? Well, the answer lies in the art of the artist. Take diplomats, for example. Diplomats seek harmony. They smooth out the way forward. They iron out differences. But we artists, we use conflict. We live in a state of paradox. And we take the energy from conflict and anger and despair, and we turn it into something else. And perhaps usefully, something as useless as art. And so the tension and the history of Iraq in the bodies of the players comes out as this raw energy in their sound, which we then transform together into joy. Beethoven is our favorite composer, and he knows a thing or two about triumph over adversity. In his Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802, he wrote to his brothers about his deafness. "And someone heard the shepherds singing, and again I heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. But little more, and I would have put an end to my life. But art it was that withheld me. It seemed impossible to leave this world without producing all that I had been called upon to produce. And so I endured this dreadful existence." And so Beethoven broke through the barrier of his deafness, went on to write his most joyful Second Symphony, and like the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq, used hell as a springboard to get to heaven. Thank you.
Thank you so much. MacAlindin.